Welcome to Tell Me Your Story, New Paradigms for a New World. I'm Richard Dugan, your host. Thanks so much for joining us. We come your way Sundays at 7 a.m. and 7 p.m., Monday mornings at 1 a.m., streaming live at richarddugan.com. We have podcasts on SoundCloud, iTunes, TuneIn Radio, Spotify, Stitcher, Player FM, Blueberry, and now we have video casts on YouTube. You can actually watch these interviews as they progress. We will be giving you our guest's website in just a few moments so that you can find out more about what our guest is all about and the work that he is doing. And we also encourage you to spend time going within during the decade of perfect vision, the 2020s, where you will find peace and serenity and calmness there, where you can get the answers to your questions, nobody else's but yours, where you will get accurate information. I promise you, the still small voice that you'll be listening to, I think, is going to help you to get through whatever tumultuous times you might be going through. And if you like what we're doing, you like the guests we're bringing to you, the subjects we're talking about, and you'd like to support us financially, we would so greatly appreciate that. All you have to do is go to our PayPal or Patreon account links that are on our website at richarddugan.com. It's on the homepage as well as the missions page. By the way, if you haven't heard Tell Me Your Story before, you want to read a little bit about us, go to our missions page. It tells you just a little bit about what we are all about if you haven't figured that out yet in terms of this particular program. And our program today is going to feature a gentleman of I want to say great scholar. He's a great scholar in the sense that he's very well educated. Physicist. I mean, the list goes on and on of all of the various things that he has accomplished in his life, especially with the work that he's done, but he's also an author. He's the author of a book we're going to talk about, as well as the work that he does and how all of this plays in. His name is Nick Nicholas, and I want to thank you so much, Nick Nicholas, PhD. I've got to throw that in there for our folks, for joining us here on the program. It's really a pleasure to have you with us.
Well, it's a pleasure to be with you.
Now, I want to make sure that I get the title of this book right. I've been practicing. The one thing I didn't do is I didn't go on Google and say, how do you pronounce Pericles? Because the title of the book is, I think it's called Pericles and Me. Did I get that right?
Pericles.
I beg your.
Pericles.
Well, see, I didn't get much mythology in high school, so. But I'm familiar with it. Pericles. My apologies to Pericles. Pericles and Me is the work that you are releasing right now. A very interesting story that is probably a mixture of fiction and fact. Is that a fair assessment?
Well, it is a work of fiction, of international intrigue, but it's based on a lot of my personal experiences. And in the preface, I challenge the reader to separate the fact from the fantasy. And it's going to be hard to do because some of the most outrageous things actually happened, but I leave that to the reader to decide.
Well, sometimes I have to say that sometimes fact sometimes can outstrip fiction in some of the things that we've seen in our lifetimes.
True.
It's just, it's like, really? That really happened? Or even some of the speculations as to what might happen if they flipped the on switch. I remember a lot of the concern on the part of, I'd have to say, non-scientific minds when they decided to flip the switch on the collider in Europe.
Yes.
Thinking, it's going to create a giant black hole. We'll all be sucked in and it's all over.
Well, they also
switch on and it didn't happen.
Well, same thing with the first atomic bomb test. There were physicists there who actually thought the atmosphere would catch on fire.
Well, oxygen does burn.
Oxygen does burn, but the atmosphere didn't, fortunately. But nobody had ever released that amount of energy before. So they really didn't know. The chances were considered very small, but still worrisome.
Yeah, sure. Well, absolutely. But of course, then you had the after effects of the radiation that moved across. And one of the things I've heard this comment about some of the technologies that we've been that we have been playing with, as this person commented, that, for example, nuclear nuclear reactor fusion and fission and so forth and so on. If you take a look at 3 Mile Island, you take a look at Chernobyl, you take a look at Fukushima, and basically, this was the assessment of this person, that we're babes playing with stuff we have no clue as to what it will really do. And yet we're jeopardizing the entire species as well as all life on this planet because we don't really know what we're doing. And politics gets involved, saving face gets involved, the public can't handle the truth gets involved. In terms of those kinds of technologies, not specifically nuclear power, but just in general, because I just saw an article about a new type of engine that probably won't be available for another couple of years, but it burns oxygen. In other words, it just draws in oxygen from the atmosphere and runs. And that the byproduct, I think, is hydrogen, because that's what oxygen, that's what, well, that's water, is H2O. What about your thoughts in terms of some of these technologies? And as a physicist yourself, do you think there are certain things we're playing with, literally playing with, and then we really might want to rethink this? Because my question always comes up: just because we can, does that mean we should?
Well, let's settle the nuclear question first, because
Okay.
that's very straightforward. 3 Mile Island, Chernobyl, and the Japanese incident are all three very distinct cases.
Mm-hmm.
The Japanese case we'll deal with directly. That was just an unfortunate episode where an act of nature collided, so to speak, and literally with a structure and brought it down. So there's not much you can do about that except not put them on the coast. 3 Mile Island actually demonstrated that a properly designed nuclear reactor is extremely safe. 3 Mile Island had a good containment vessel, a negligible amount of radiation escaped. The event occurred because of a human error and an unfortunate lack of redundancy in a critical place. Chernobyl, I know a good deal about because I spent so much time in Ukraine. I got to know the director for nuclear and radiation safety, and all you had to do was whisper Chernobyl and he'd go off like a rocket. The reason Chernobyl was such a disaster, it has no containment vessel. That is to say, and the Soviet reactors did not. Why? Because they were poor, and two, they don't care about human life. The Soviets didn't care about human life as long as they won. I'll give you an example. I had a talk with a Ukrainian general, 3 stars, pretty high up in the hierarchy, and he told me how terrified the Soviets were of the United States. And I said, why? He said, because if we'd had your power, we would have launched the first strike. And I said, if you had, you would have lost 50, 100 million people. He said, the Politburo didn't care as long as they won. Now, that's just his opinion, but I have no reason to doubt it. As far as other sciences go, it's hard to say. There's so much going on, such diverse areas. Right now, biology and derivatives of biology is really the hot ticket.
Yeah.
And for example, the vaccine that we now have on the way, I mean, that was a great departure from the way vaccines are usually made, is my understanding.
Yeah.
We're really just beginning to scratch the biological surface. I have a close friend who is a world famous cell biologist, and when he lectures, my gosh, it's just fascinating. So we are tinkering with things. I personally don't know of any technology that's going to blow up the world or turn us all into mutants. The fears on nuclear radiation didn't quite pan out. My understanding is that we did not get the levels of cancer that were expected at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Got a lot, but not what the expectations were.
Yeah.
We've learned a lot since then, and it appears that radiation is extremely dangerous, but we can contain it. So I believe in science, not blindly, And science has its place. Politicians keep saying follow the science, but you can't just follow the science when you're making political decisions. Science is one element. I used to teach courses, and I still do occasionally, on underwater acoustics and submarine warfare. And at the end of my lecture, I used to admonish my students not to use analysis as a substitute for military decision making. Analysis is one element. So if analysis tells you that if you take your submarine into this situation, it's almost a death sentence, yet a successful mission would save the whole fleet, you send the submarine in. We do that again and again. And analysis will tell you what your chances are, and you have to make contingencies. Mm-hmm. Similar true with the virus, I suppose, and with everything else. It is an element. Just blindly saying follow the science is incorrect, in my opinion.
Yeah. I know that as far as nuclear power is concerned, setting aside the explanations you've given for the three specific instances that I brought up, one of the biggest concerns, of course, is the fuel rods, the waste product afterwards. But I've also heard that they are finding ways, rather than burying it in the ground, they're finding ways to sort of recycle them. So, you know, there's some inroads in that direction, which is good. I also am wondering what your perspective is, and we're going to go back quite a number of years here to the work, the limited knowledge of, in one sense, the work of Nikola Tesla.
Tesla was a genius and an extremely generous man, a truly remarkable individual. I've read a bit about Tesla. I'm not an expert on his work by any means, but he was well ahead of his contemporaries in his understanding of electricity and electromagnetic phenomena. He stands out in my mind. Man died poor.
Yeah.
If he had only executed his own patents, he would have been an incredibly wealthy man. But he wanted the world to have them. He was that selfless. Mm-hmm. And he came into conflict with Thomas Edison. Edison was a completely different sort of scientist. Edison was a remarkably dogged experimenter. Mm-hmm. I mean, before he made his successful electric light bulb, he tried thousands of materials for filaments. And it took a man of that driven determination to complete that. Tesla was a completely different fellow. He could see ahead. He was very intuitive, and his intuition was usually on the mark. And he produced a great many innovations that we use today. If you went to a library and looked up his innovations, the list is as long as your arm. A remarkable scientist and a remarkable human being.
And that's rather remarkable, considering the reported level of suppression that he experienced due to the fact that he wanted everyone to have it. And both Edison, as well as, I believe, was it not, I want to say J.P. Morgan, who was invested in copper, and copper wires were what they were using to send electricity from one place to another. And he didn't want to have that jeopardized. That was all about money in that respect. Is that, you know?
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised. But there was a basic difference between Edison and Tesla. Tesla favored alternating current electricity. Mm-hmm. Edison, direct current. Now, the trouble with direct current is that the further you send it, the less current you have left due to resistance in the wiring. Tesla's alternating current, you could step up the voltage by using transformers periodically, and therefore could send it much greater distances. Direct current could not stand up to the advantages of alternating current. This word on the spent nuclear fuel rods. When the fuel rods are spent, you've only used 10 or 20% of the energy in those fuel rods. There was an executive order, I believe, given by President Jimmy Carter, that we could not reprocess our spent fuel rods. Because if you do so, you can get a small amount of fissile material, bomb-making material out of it. And he wanted to be an example to the world. It's an example that nobody has followed. In fact, I'm told that other countries kept trying to buy our spent fuel rods because it was a very inexpensive way to get more material for your reactors. Mm-hmm. You're exactly right. There's a lot you can do with them. In my opinion, the reason we haven't solved this problem is a lack of will. That's all. It's not a technical problem.
Yeah. And it's interesting you use that term because back in the early mid 1980s, when we were debating in Congress about, I'm trying to remember, it was term limits, I think it was. And I was talking with then the Senator John McCain, I believe it was. And I asked him point blank, I said, why is it that we can't get, why can't we get, you guys, why do you, or no, it was an amendment to balance the budget. That was it. Amendment to balance the budget. I said, what do you need an amendment for? Why can't you guys just do it? And his comment to me was, there isn't the will on Capitol Hill. And of course I didn't get to follow up that because he had to go to the floor. But it was like, wait a minute, you're part of Congress, you're part of the Senate and the House and so forth. Why can't you exert your will to try to convince some of these people that we need to do? Because you and I, Joe and John Citizen, we got to balance our budgets or we have serious problems. I always thought that was really a strange bit of logic that just basically push the subject aside. And it's a really kind of unfortunate in that regard. One of the other things I wanted to ask you about, and we want to get into Pericles and me as well, because I find that interesting. There was a book I read many years ago that just intrigued me to no end, and I have not been able to find both an audible copy of it, let alone a print copy of a book that was called, and it was very intriguing to me. It was a spy kind of thing called Operation Destruct. And a very fascinating book. I vaguely remember, some of the details of it. I just remember it was a really fascinating book. In terms of fact and fiction, it seems like fiction becomes fact after a while. Let's say if you're talking science fiction. I mean, look at Star Trek, and they had those pads that they would write on and all this kind of stuff. Right now, boy, that's mainstream for us today. We take that for granted today. And then of course I'm still waiting for those little light devices that Dr. McCoy would hover over your body to diagnose you, that kind of thing.
And fix you.
Right. Exactly.
That's right.
It to me, that's fascinating. Let's talk about Pericles and me. First of all, for those of us, myself included, okay, Nick, tell us, who do I say was or is Pericles?
Well, Pericles was the political leader of Athens during its golden age. He came from a celebrated family. He was unusual in many ways. He had vision. I mean, he was a truly remarkable man. And I use him as a device in my book so that I can have conversations with Pericles and talk things through, nuances of the plot. Pericles and Alex ruminate on human nature. They one thing they say, human nature hasn't changed. So over the centuries, our weapons have gotten better, but we did the same sort of things. For example, the Spartans catapulted bodies that died from plague over the walls of Athens in order to infect the Athenians. Oh, so that's biological warfare, isn't it?
It is. Yeah.
The Athenians poisoned the Spartans' water wells. That's chemical warfare, and so on. So they did all the same stuff. And they even used some of the same politics. One example we used was the ancient Athens depended heavily on the Black Sea coast for some of its grain to feed this big city. A city was 200,000 or 300,000 was huge in those days. And the people who ran those towns that dotted the Black Sea coast were becoming restive. So Pericles sent a fleet of some 100 triremes, these 3 levels of warships of the Athenians that were so effective, on a friendship visit. And that seemed to settle everything down. Well, Teddy Roosevelt did the same thing with the Great White Fleet. He sent it to the Pacific, and it was a friendly friendship visit, but it sent an unmistakable signal that the United States was going to protect its interests in the Pacific. So they have these kinds of conversations. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, Alex is trying to advance his interests in the plot, and he confers with Pericles, they talk about the difference between political judgment and scientific judgment. They have a lot of conversations. They talk about character. They talk about what kind of judgments that you can make, touching upon morality, but not too much, because that's such a slippery subject, as we all know.
Yeah.
So Pericles was a device, and I think it worked pretty well because the character of Pericles, the history of Pericles, is so deep, you could literally talk about anything with them. And Pericles comes to him in his dreams, and he's not sure.
Not sure.
Goes on from there.
Okay. Well, it's what's interesting to me is the fact that what you're describing almost virtually parallels where we are today in terms of these conversations, these discussions over science versus politics and policy and so forth. And every time I hear these discussions, especially about this virus, which we've talked about a little bit on this program from time to time, and what I always comes to mind are the phrases in the Declaration of Independence versus the First Amendment. And I say versus only because that's the way a lot of people see it. And in the Declaration of Independence,
I've lost the audio.
You've lost my audio.
No.
You can't hear me?
I hear you now. You came back.
All right. 3, 2, 1. I wanted to ask you in reference to, for example, this virus we've been talking about occasionally on this program, but also the issue as you've described, where the science versus politics seems to be mirrored from your book to modern day, which is really, really interesting, the conversations. But I talk to people a lot about this aspect of people's individual rights, i.e. the First Amendment, versus as the Declaration of Independence says, and possibly maybe it's in the preamble I'm thinking, where it says to preserve, to promote the general welfare.
Yes.
Okay. And preserve the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, our children, our children's children, our children's children's children. And I hear this comment about how I have the constitutional right. I don't have to wear a mask. I don't have to do this. I don't have to do that. Or I can do whatever I want, whenever I want, wherever I want, how I want. And so I've always placed the question out there to people who are of that mind. And again, I'm not passing judgment. If that's how you feel, you have every right to feel that way. And you have every right to say, I have the constitutional right to blah, blah, blah. But how do you weigh that against promoting the general welfare and securing the blessings? Because I don't believe one has to give up their individual rights. I'm not giving up my individual rights by wearing a mask, for example. I'm exercising them by being considerate of other people. Do I have the virus? God, I hope not, but I don't want to give it to anybody else. And they say that's the main reason why you wear a mask, not to protect yourself from others, but to protect others from you. So let's talk a little bit about these two seemingly diametrically opposed perspectives when it comes to the sciences, whether it be, for example, in vitro fertilization, gene splicing, CRISPR, that technology, because you were talking about that earlier in terms of the biological sciences are like, at the top of the list these days, not to mention looking for vaccines for viruses and so forth. Have you had to deal with that concept at all in some of the conversations you've had or some of the lectures you've given over the years? And I don't know, maybe this is treading on that area of morality, but it just seems to me like we need to come to some kind of consensus on this, where an individual doesn't feel like their rights are being trampled, and at the same time, the society doesn't feel like their lives are being jeopardized.
Well, I think that there are rights, there are obligations, and there's also prudence. It's prudent to wear the mask. I personally don't know how effective it is. I have a daughter who's a cardiologist. She's not sure how effective it is. She says it has some effect, but be that as it may, out of consideration for other people, I wear my mask because I don't want to worry them. So there's such a thing as prudence in addition to rights and so on, and it takes some judgment. We keep forgetting about judgment in our political ramblings. I mean, what's the point in worrying people to show that you're independent, to show that you're protecting your rights? It's not much of a concession to wear a mask, for crying out loud. I'm against the mandate because I just don't like mandates. They smack too much of totalitarianism. But I'm still going to wear my mask whether a politician says I have to or not. And there's that. As far as some general grand principles on what you do, I think you have to go case by case because they're all so different from each other. But for heaven's sakes, let's just be prudent about these things. I have a car that'll do 150 miles an hour, and I love to drive that way. I enjoy the German autobahns, but you can't because Americans don't have the same lane discipline that the Germans do. You're going to get yourself killed. So it's prudence. I don't think there's much more to say about it than that.
Okay. It's interesting. Nicholas is my guest. Pericles and Me is the title of this book. How did, and I've noticed this with a lot of our guests who have had very intellectual leanings early on in their careers, and then suddenly this other area pops up in their lives where I'm going to write some fiction, or I'm going to write, or I'm going to paint, or I'm going to create music, and so on and so forth. How did writing begin for you at an early age, or was this something that came up later in your career that you said, I've got these ideas and I've got to get them down on paper?
Well, first of all, scientists write all the time.
Sure.
Articles, papers, and so on. And for me, that was the burdensome part. I have a character flaw when it comes to being a scientist. And once I figure out how something works, I want to move on to something else, but I have to stop and write a report or else nobody will pay me. So I had to do that. As far as Pericles and Me goes, I have a lot of friends and we converse a lot and we tell each other stories. And people have been urging me for decades to write a book about my experiences because I've worked in the Middle East. I've worked all over Europe. I was very early into Ukraine after the Soviet Union broke up. When I got there, it was still very Soviet. Had somebody following me, who became my advisor because I told him he could walk with me and do this in a civilized manner. And pretty soon he was my advisor. But all of these things bundled together is what generated Pericles and Me. And I sat down and I wrote it in 3 months. It's about 400 pages, and there was no outline, no plan, nothing. I just followed wherever my intuition, wherever my feelings took me. And I think it turned out reasonably well. It's not great literature. I remember my literature professor at college saying to me, none of you is going to be a Shakespeare or Scott Fitzgerald, but by God, you're going to learn how to write a simple declarative sentence. And that has stood me in good stead. It's also stood me in good stead all the times I had to converse and negotiate through an interpreter. Because when you talk through an interpreter, you can't use convoluted language or slang. It will obscure the meaning. So, today we're going to talk about the next step in our project, period. The next step is, period. And you go on like that. And that's about the way I wrote Pericles and Me. And I like the book. I hope other people will too. My friends who have read it, who know me well, all liked it. And I hope that's an indication of what the general public will do. But writing it was a release for me because I saw a lot of things that were unpleasant, politically stupid, operationally stupid, and they always bothered me. For example, when the Soviet Union broke up, there was a bill called the Nunn-Lugar bill, because Senators Nunn and Senators Lugar sponsored it, to put up $400 million to take down the nukes that the fragments of the Soviet Union had within them. And people in the United States, especially government people, fell on this like it was the carcass of a beach whale. That money was supposed to take down the nukes, and they were trying to capture it for the U.S. national labs and for other purposes, because defense funding suddenly dropped because the Cold War was over, so to speak. That sort of thing you see, and you just shake your head and you wonder, I know you need money to keep your organization going, but this was such an important mission that you didn't want to take the money away from that. In fact, I was invited to Ukraine by the Ukrainian government to advise them on taking down the nukes. And they gave me pretty much carte blanche to go see what I wanted to see. And I really got a good look at what the Soviet Union was all about. There's not a thing wrong with the people there. They're decent people, they're hardworking, they're good family people. They certainly would treat you, if you're decent with them, they're decent in return. But the system they lived under was horrendous. And still, there are people there. There were people there when I was traveling around there. There were people there who still believed in the communist system because that's all they ever heard. Mm-hmm. And then, we could talk forever about all of that, but suffice it to say that if that's all you ever hear, you're going to believe at least part of it. I mean, the Nazis understood that very well. Joseph Goebbels, the minister for propaganda, is the one who coined the saying, if you say something long enough and loud enough, people will believe it. And that seems true. And that's what worries me now. Our news reporting is so slanted one way or the other. There always has been slant news reporting. There were newspapers that hated FDR, but there are also papers that supported him. And that's all right in a democracy. But in a country that's closed, the Soviet Union was, it's hard to overcome that.
Well, that's one of the reasons why we promote choices and knowledge of those choices. We encourage people to become more educated about the different possibilities. And when you talk about science, for example, one invention leads to another, leads to another, leads to another, because somebody sees that thing and says, I could improve on that, or I could probably use that to help to facilitate the creation of this other idea that I have, and so on and so on and so on. And so we have this evolutionary process that's going on. But if you never see any of this stuff, you're most likely never going to create it. And it's never going to, and things are never going to move forward, and we're never going to evolve.
And the people we have a hard time explaining are people like Nikola Tesla, who come along and ignore everything and go off in such a radically different direction. We don't know how he ever got there. And that's where his intuition comes into play. Tesla was one of those people who had, and intuition isn't just guessing.
Not at all.
I mean, it's based on your training. It's based on your experiences. It's also based on your thought processes. And, some people like Tesla and Einstein have unique thought processes. Einstein used to imagine, he had these thought experiments he would do. For example, he imagined what it might be like to travel along a light beam. And from that, he derived his theory of special relativity. And but the mathematics, it's a highly mathematical theory, but the mathematics is not what makes it. What makes it was his imagination. And then he had to find the mathematics to express that imagination in a form that would be useful to others.
Yeah.
Generally speaking, these kinds of intuitive breakthroughs occur when someone imagines something and then he goes back and fixes up the scientific steps behind it so he could explain it to others. And that's what Einstein did a lot of.
Did you do a lot of that yourself as you were working and creating and so forth?
I never thought about it, but after I retired, I did reflect on it a bit. And yes, I did. I did that. Sometimes it can lead you a little astray. I recall one formulation, mathematical physics, where it was brilliant. I'm telling you, it was the greatest thing since sliced bread. And I took it to a scientist I knew who was very bright, a Korean, brilliant man, and he liked it. That made me feel a little better. But then I went back and made some calculations of simple cases whose answers I knew, and I got the wrong answer. And I knew something was wrong. It took me about 2 weeks to figure it out, and I went back and showed it again to my friend Quan Yu. And he used to do this Charlie Chan act when he felt like it. And he leaned back in his chair and he said, a subtle but fatal error. And your intuition can lead you astray, but that's all right. If it most of the time leads you in the right direction, that's just part of the scientific game, if you want to call it that.
And maybe that being led astray is supposed to reveal to you a certain element that you need once you get back on track.
Well, in this case, it did.
Yeah.
It did. I was able to reformulate the thing and get on the right track. That's true.
And at the same time, of course, when we spend time going within, as I promote here on this program, sometimes all we need to do is we need to stop. We need to calm down. We need to find that place of equanimity, if you will, that peaceful place, so that we may be able to ponder, as you talked about earlier, what is we're doing. Maybe we need to think about, sometimes you have to get away from it in order for the ideas to come. I mean, I've seen that happen more times than not, where people will actually say, you know what, I'm going to take a break and I'm going to go do whatever. I'm going to do something else that takes my mind off of this. And somehow the idea suddenly comes, or the solution or the answer to whatever part that they're working on just arrives. I mean, I've had that happen where my wife, of course, she's very concerned, as most wives are, about their husbands getting up on ladders with chainsaws. And I was trying to fell a tree. And so I have the ladder, and I moved the ladder around this dead tree, this pine tree that I had cut all the limbs off of and everything. But I still needed to bring it down from maybe 15 or 20 feet down to 8 or 10 feet so that I could deal with it. But I didn't want it to fall down on the fencing that was nearby. So I moved the ladder around 3 or 4 or 5 times around the tree, and I could not for the life of me figure out which was the best position. And I said, you know what? I don't have to do this today. I'm going to come back to this. So I put the chainsaw away, left the ladder against the tree, went in the house. The next day I came out, put the ladder in the first spot, took care of it. Everything worked out perfectly. And that was just all I needed to do. And everything worked out just fine. So sometimes we do need to take that time, and we encourage people always to do that. We're talking with Nick Nicholas. He is the author of Pericles and Me, a fictional book with a few factual pieces of information that I want to talk a little bit about as well. And part of that has to do with the fact that you are very, very proud of, and not in an egotistical way, I might add, of your Greek heritage, are you not?
I am. Both of my parents were Greek immigrants. They met in the United States and married. My father was a Greek Cypriot, so he came here. He was just a boy. He came here alone. My mother is from Corinth, which had been once upon a time the biggest city in the world, until the earthquakes and the Romans got through with it. And they valued the traditional Greek cultural elements, education. They valued hard work. They valued. My sister took a course in sociology when she was at Pitt, and the professor asked why so many Greeks own restaurants. She didn't know, even though her father owned one and her uncle owned one. And he finally said, because Greeks are the only people who are willing to work hard enough to start a restaurant, which is a very difficult business. So they're hardworking. They valued education greatly. I was the first one in my family to go to college. Now in my family, we've got MDs, PhDs, engineers, lawyers, you name it. And it all stemmed from that original Greek heritage. In addition to going to public school, I went to a Greek school where we studied the Greek language, Greek culture, and the Greek Orthodox religion. The teacher the headmaster was chairman of the classics department at the University of Pittsburgh, and he taught in the Socratic fashion. I realized when I got to high school that we had discussed the postulates of plane geometry in Greek in his class. He had a discussion once a week where he would ask us to express our opinions, but you had to do it in Greek. So that was a pretty, actually, it was a good class. We all liked it very much. And so education was important. I'm a graduate of Carnegie Mellon University. It was Carnegie Tech when I went there, where I got my bachelor's degree. I got my master's degree at Drexel in Philadelphia, and my PhD at Catholic U in Washington. Why did I go to 3 schools? Because I mistakenly thought after I graduated from college, I'd know a lot. I didn't think I did. So I went and got a master's degree. Surely then I'd know a lot. I still didn't think I did. So I went and got a PhD, and I still don't know a lot. That's the way I see the world. But I know a little bit, and I know enough to have a good profession. My profession, very unusual. Early in my profession, I worked on the Apollo program. I was the engineering officer in the first simulated Apollo flight. I spent 8 days in an Apollo capsule doing everything it takes to fly to the moon. Of course, we never left the ground, but we learned a lot from that, about the workloads and how things would work out. I worked in a great many different areas of physics and unusually broad stuff, and I always went for the interest. That's why I traveled to the Middle East, to Europe, and whatnot.
Well, I'll tell you that a couple of things. Number one, our landlord, who has since passed away on the property where we live, he also worked for NASA. He actually helped engineer the lunar module, which I thought was very interesting. That landed on the moon,
Yeah.
and of course subsequently took off from there. So this is intriguing. The other part is that I have a great affinity for the Greek culture, not because of my heritage, but because back in my early days of broadcasting, I used to produce a program with hosts, and they would bring in all the materials called the All New Greek Family Hour. And I only learned a few words of Greek. Opa, Efharisto. That's about as far as my Greek goes.
That's all you need.
Baklava is good too.
Yeah.
And Guido. But I loved being around these folks, and we would go to the Greek festival each year at the Greek Orthodox Church in Phoenix, and it was a wonderful time, and I, like I said, I still remember the days of producing that program, and even had a sort of a taste of it when I married my first wife, who was not Greek, but she and her family were part of the Byzantine Rite of the Catholic Church, which is very Orthodox. Well,
Yes, it is.
then you think about the Greek Orthodox Church and then so forth. And I'm curious about your upbringing, philosophically, as I like to put it, in that regard. I would assume that you grew up in the Greek Orthodox Church.
I did. In fact, the name of our church was St. Nicholas, which I always imagined was named after me, but alas, it wasn't. No, in fact, I started writing a second book, and the title is I'm Not a Greek, I'm from Pittsburgh. And I got that title at my favorite watering hole in Heidelberg, Germany. I spent a lot of time in Heidelberg, a great town. And this was shortly after the Greek national soccer team had won the European Cup, which was a big surprise because they had no big stars. And the German came up to me and he said, "You Greeks must be very happy." And I said, "I'm not a Greek, I'm from Pittsburgh." And all the Americans in the place knew exactly what I was saying, but the Europeans were very puzzled by the whole thing. They don't quite grasp that we Americans, many of us, have two heritages, so to speak. And yet I grew up, I was a thoroughly American kid. I went to American public schools. I played sports, American sports all my life, and considered myself an American with Greek heritage, but an American nonetheless. And many of us have that. So that was a good way to grow up, I thought, because it gave you an outlook that's broader than you might otherwise have had you not had some ethnic heritage to go along with your American upbringing.
Do you feel that maybe some of that is lost today from the standpoint that maybe some people are going a little bit overboard with their heritage from where they've come from here in the United States? Because I hear this comment on occasion from certain groups of people who say we're losing our culture because we're being inundated by all of these other people who want to force their culture on us, and yet this is supposed to be a melting pot where we're supposed to learn from one another. I mean, who doesn't love going to some of these basic, I'll call them ethnic fairs, like the Greek fair or the Irish fair or the Italian fair or any of the other ethnicities, or even the parts of town, like up in San Francisco. I know they have a Chinatown, and there are different parts all over the country where you have certain areas where these certain ethnicities have been living for generations peacefully, calmly, and other people come there from other ethnicities to experience the culture, to try the food and even the clothing and so on and so forth. And it just seems like there's a lot more, I want to say, animosity towards the other cultures because people are, I don't know, people are feeling infringed upon. Have you ever felt that way or experienced that, or has that ever been a thought of yours as far as the United States being this beautiful melting pot of different cultures?
Well, first of all, as a child of immigrants, I'd be a terrible hypocrite if I did feel that way. Secondly, historically, as a boy, I remember hearing people decry all the Eastern Europeans who were coming here. But, I worked in a steel mill for a while, and if without Eastern Europeans, there would have been no steel mills. I mean, all their names ended with an I. And, and I've heard people talk about too many Italians came here. Well, I don't agree. So there's nothing new about that. Yeah. I don't feel threatened by it because let me turn myself inside out in the sense that my Greek heritage is very strong within me. It's strong within my children too, although in a different way. Mm-hmm. They're one generation down the road. They did not have to hear someone referring to their parents as foreigners. And I feel my heritage strong. I like it, but it doesn't make me less of an American. Mm-hmm. By God, I'm as American as anybody. It's the only country in the world when I was growing up where I could have gone and gotten a PhD and traveled the world. You couldn't do that in Germany because you were sorted out at the age of 12 as to whether you were going to be an academic or not. Here, we get to choose this. As far as the current wave of immigrations, I mean, I believe in legal immigrations, and let's just leave that right there.
Okay.
I got no heartburn about that. I had a colleague at Penn State University, Mexican heritage, but his family has lived in Texas for about 100 years. And he had his career as a helicopter pilot, fighting in Desert Storm. Is he less American than you and I? No, of course not. Even if he'd never been in the military, he's no less an American. So I think those cries are either trumped up or they're by people who are foolish, prejudiced, and in my mind, quite stupid.
I've also learned too, you need to know your audience. I had a gal I was working with at a radio station back in Phoenix, and we were chatting away. It was about another programmer that would come in with his entourage, and they were from Mexico, but they were here on visas and what have you. But they came in dressed to the nines. I mean, beautiful, immaculate suits and tie and the whole thing. And they would come in and do their program overnight and so forth. And my observation was, as I was sharing with her, I said, my gosh, they're so arrogant. They're so full of themselves. And she says, no, you're misreading it. It's not that they're arrogant. That's confidence. That's the confidence they have. So then I started chatting with her more, and I said, so what about your Hispanic heritage? And boy, she turned on me, could have hit me with a 2x4. She was mad. She says, I am not. And she didn't have any problem with Mexicans, but she wasn't from Mexico.
That's right.
Her family was from Spain.
I've encountered that as myself. In fact, my Mexican Marine did not like being called the Hispanic. He said, I'm not Hispanic, damn it, I'm Mexican.
Yeah.
And so, we create these categories and we populate them through our imaginations, and we sometimes step on people's toes, and they tell us.
Yeah, they do. They do indeed. I know that as a kid growing up, I was born legally blind. And then, of course, as political correctness started to creep in I guess the late 70s and in the 80s, they used to refer to it as visually challenged. And I said, no, 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 no. I'm not challenged. I'm blind. Okay. Now I could see well enough to ride a bicycle and so forth, and read large print books and what have you, until my 38th year, and I had a lens implant. So it's one of those things where I didn't ever have a problem with that. As a matter of fact, I created a wonderful little joke. I said, first of all, as I mentioned to you, I'm from Phoenix, Arizona. I'm a native born Phoenician, and I was born blind. So I am a Phoenician blind.
That's pretty good. I like that.
And that's what I used to tell people. I said, and I didn't have a problem with it. And the blind people that I associated with in early days of my career, because I was working for a radio reading service for the blind and visually impaired, they didn't have a problem with being referred to as blind. Their problem, of course, was the fact that there weren't sufficient accommodations at that particular point in time. And of course, ADA came along and so forth. But it is interesting how the more things change, it sometimes does seem like, as you kind of expressed, they kind of stay the same. And that's why on this program, we try to give a diversity, if you will, or as many different points along the circle, as we like to say. There's an event going on in the circle, and we want to have people moving around that circle to see it from as many perspectives as possible. You've heard the old the whole story about a car accident and 10 people saw it. Well, you're going to get 10 different answers to the questions about what they saw, because each one was standing in a different place.
You remind me of the debriefing I got from the CIA after my first trip to Ukraine. My partner and I were in a skiff. That's a room lined with copper, so no one can spy on you electronically.
Sort of like a Faraday cage?
That's right.
Okay.
And it was called a skiff in those days.
Mm-hmm.
And we were there for 8 or 9 hours. And after it was done, they said, "You guys are great." And I said, "Well, thank you." And they said, No, you don't understand. You know the difference between what you saw, what you were told, and what you deduced. And I'm thinking there, I was alarmed. I was thinking, don't your agents know the difference? But it relates to what you said about the 10 people in the accidents. Regarding sobriquets for people and their problems, our oldest son has been deaf since birth.
Mm-hmm.
He now has an implant, so he can hear somewhat. And his first day driving to work, he said, truck went by and scared the hell out of him. And he said, "I never knew what your hearing people have to put up with." In any case, he persisted. He went to college on an athletic scholarship. He's an engineer, a top flight engineer. He's doing very well in life. And I'm very proud of him. He had that to overcome. And that, I believe, overcoming that hearing problem, and he had no heartburn with people telling him he was deaf. They wanted to use the term hearing impaired. He said, like you, he said, "I'm not hearing impaired, I'm deaf."
Yeah.
And
I've also come up with the phrase, it is not a disability. It's a perceived limitation. As you just described with your son, it limits you only as much as you allow it to.
That's true. That's true. Up to a point. I mean, there are some things, obviously, he can't hear things that are at a distance.
Sure.
He's compensated. He's got eyes that are like vacuum cleaners. It's one of the things that made him. That's one of the things that made him such a good athlete, because he could see things developing that hearing people might not have seen, because they're relying on their hearing and not their eyes as much as he had to do everything with his eyes. So you're right, though. People have problems. They have disabilities, and some overcome them and some don't.
Yeah. Now, you come across to me as a very proud father of your children.
Don't get me started on the other 3. We'll be here for hours.
Well, I'll tell you, it's
because they've done well. They were loving. He never had any serious problems with the kids.
Well, I would say that my parents, because I've had an opportunity, believe it or not, I've had them on this program. And they feel the same way about us as you do about your children.
We
And
should.
that's what's interesting. And when you made the description, and I heard this years ago, even before the Cold War was over, that the Russian people in particular, in then the USSR, they didn't have a problem with Americans.
No, they
They
didn't.
had the same family structure. They had the same love and hate and frustration and fear of their life and their children and keeping them safe and happy and so forth as we did. It was always the government. And that was the one thing that sort of ended my feelings in regards to the quote unquote Cold War, that this ain't about the people, the citizens. This is
No,
about
it's
the two
not.
governments.
It never was.
Yeah.
It never was really. My uncle, my mother's brother, was a soldier during World War II. Highly decorated. I don't think he was a citizen when he joined the army. He was a citizen after the war. They made him a citizen, and he met up with the Russians at the Elbe River, and he said they were just fine. He said they tended to drink too much, but so did we. He said, you know, no, it's seldom between people. Look, you got to cut these people some slack. Don't forget, Stalin was a monster. And if he even suspected that you might be thinking about not agreeing with him, you're dead.
Yeah.
There were people in the Politburo who took their lives in their hands when they stopped the killings, because he would kill you and then everyone who in your family and then everyone who knew anybody in your family, and he would have wiped out the population if they'd let it go.
Yeah.
So that's the difference between them and us. They lived under a monster and we never did.
And the only difference here is that you aren't killed. You're just fired. You're just fired.
That's right. That's
Yeah.
right.
This, to me, this is interesting how, and I would venture that quite a bit of what we've talked about here on the program is weaved into Pericles and Me, the book that that Nick Nicholas has written. What is the website you want people to go to find out
Well,
more about that book, but also about what you are all about?
all they have to do is input my name and the site will come up. The name is Nicholas C. Nicholas.
NicholasCNicholas.com.
Yes, no, just Nicholas C. Nicholas, and it comes right up.
All right.
It's available on Amazon, on Barnes & Noble, and all the other sites. An audio version is being done as we speak.
Oh, excellent. Love them. By the way, I was listening to audiobooks in my early years, my single digits and teens, long before Audible was even thought of. They were called Recordings for the Blind and Talking Books for the Blind. And that's where I started with my metaphysical primer, Autobiography of a Yogi, which I have listened to who knows how many thousands of times in the last 40, 45 years. And I'm 60 today, and I still love that book and many others as well. And I know folks are going to enjoy Pericles and Me as well. And we will be linked to your website, Nick, so that people can go straight there from our website and get in touch with you and find out about the work that you've done. And I have to tell you, it's fascinating from my perspective, because I loved watching the launches of the Saturn V's in the 60s and early 70s with Apollo. And I have to say that the moon landing mission of Apollo 11, and this is just my observation, was the last time that not only this country, but virtually the entire world at that time was focused on something of such a positive nature. And I honestly do not believe we have had anything like that since.
I agree.
And it's really unfortunate because, my God, if we can get to the moon in 10 years, there's nothing that we can't accomplish.
No, I think you're quite right. And by the way, I'd like to recommend another metaphysical book to you. It's called Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance.
I've heard of it, and I'm going to get a copy. I'll go on Audible and get it.
It's not only entertaining, it's insightful as well.
Yeah. Well, I greatly appreciate the time that you have given us here on the program. I do have three final questions that I would like to ask you. I ask all of my guests. You might have addressed the answers within the context of what we've talked about today, but I do like to ask the questions pointedly here at the end of the program. Before I do that, however, I need to let our listeners know that the program is here on Sundays at 7 a.m. and 7 p.m., Monday mornings at 1 a.m. We do stream live at those times at richarddugan.com. The podcasts, unlike the broadcasts, are available on SoundCloud, iTunes, TuneIn Radio, and a bunch of other locations that you will find. We're also on YouTube with the video cast now, so you can go to Richard Dugan, that's the channel, and you can certainly listen and watch these interviews and see our guests, which is really kind of nice. We can't meet in person directly, but we can meet in person virtually, and it's always nice to be able to do that. And we will be linked to Nick Nicholas' website so that you can continue your evolutionary process, your transformation through the writings that he's done and even some of the work that he's done that may very well intrigue you as much as it has me. And if you'd like to support what we're doing, please do so at PayPal or Patreon accounts. We have the links on our website for you to do so, and we hope that you will. And we thank you, and thank you for the support you've given and the support that you will give. So the three questions that I will start with, number one, are: who is Nick C. Nicholas?
Who am I? I've never been asked that question before. I'm a fellow who had the good fortune to grow up in a wonderful family in a terrific country, and I have traveled, I've studied, I've played a lot of sports. I love the sports. As you alluded to before, it's a good counter. You need to have a counter to what you work at. And sports was a counter. I mean, more than once I went out to play tennis when I was stumped and came back with the answer. And that's about all I can say about me. I have a wonderful family, 4 great children, a wife who has supported me faithfully throughout the years, although sometimes she had to grit her teeth, but she did it.
Well, and we hear her chuckling in the background, and we're glad that she's with you.
Sorry.
Yeah, she is.
No apologies necessary. I think that's wonderful. My wife used to join me on these programs when we did it at another station, and so I'm grateful that you and your husband are there together. Second question: what is it that you hope to or want to achieve through the work that you are doing now?
Well, I like to entertain people with my writings while informing them. And that's fun. And you know, I don't write with outlines and things. I mean, my sister also writes, and she was an English teacher, so she's got the technique. Boy, she was shocked that I didn't use an outline to write my book. I just sat down and it poured out. Took me 3 months. I wrote every day, and I enjoyed it. So that's what I'd like to do. I'm not so sure that the other 2 books I'm writing, and the third one is entitled How I Won the Cold War, and they're intended to amuse and also to inform. How I Won the Cold War will do that because of the subject matter. I'm Not a Greek, I'm from Pittsburgh is about the more entertaining aspects of my career, and it ends up, I think, so far representing an era that is long gone. I mean, schools are different, everything's different now. Yeah. Not worse, not better, just different.
And the final question: what is your life's purpose?
My life's purpose, that's a hard one to answer. I'm not sure. My life didn't have a foreordained purpose. It could achieve some things, as every life does. And I guess those are the purposes. I mean, I had an interesting career. I leave behind me 4 children, discounting 9 grandchildren, and they're all different from each other. There are no 2 people in my family who are the same. And that's the wonderful thing about human beings. We all blather about diversity, but the real diversity is the difference between individuals, not the differences between ethnic groups.
I would agree with you there. Absolutely. And I thank you again for giving us so much time here on the program, both you and your wife, to share your story as well as the story of Pericles and me. and it's available on Amazon. The Audible is coming, and we will look forward to that. And again, my great appreciation for the time that you've given us today, Nick.
My pleasure.
I'm Richard Dugan. I want to thank you for listening to Tell Me Your Story, New Paradigms for a New World, as we give you choices and knowledge of those choices to help make your dreams come true. Until our next broadcast, podcast, videocast, love to Lal. And we are